I'm Werner von Braun. This motion picture was produced to enable you to experience more personally and vividly the most dramatic events of the Apollo 11 story. The pictures and sounds are real, recorded in real time, where the action really was. So, come with us. We are going to the moon.
This film will not only attempt to articulate a connection between the filming techniques Hollywood directors develop in production with NASA and the filming techniques then later used by NASA to fake spacewalks, ISS live feeds, rocket launches, rovers, and any video that claims to be dealing in outer space, but will also expose the hidden timeline of events that created NASA and their many cover-ups. Many times, we see a film about space or space travel with extraordinary effects be released to the public, which is then followed up by some sort of special event put on by NASA, which seems to utilize the techniques that were developed by Hollywood recently. For example, 2001: A Space Odyssey was released in 1968, featuring the most realistic manned space travel sequences on film at this time. Just months later, in 1969, NASA would claim to film themselves landing men on the moon with video sequences that utilize the exact same front screen projection filming techniques perfected by Stanley Kubrick for his film 2001: A Space Odyssey. Or more recently, with Gravity being released in 2013 and Life being released in 2017 with incredible sequences of flowing zero-gravity shots inside the International Space Station. After these films were released, we saw NASA become way more comfortable with their ISS live feeds, who also seem to utilize the harness system developed for these films. Honestly, just watching the special features on these films will show you perfectly how easy it could be for NASA to fake their videos. For some sections of this film, I will use segments from Jay Weidner's Kubrick's Odyssey documentaries. While I personally do not agree with everything he says, I strongly encourage you to seek out his work yourselves. Lastly, this film will cover a vast array of information over several decades of time. It is an extensive investigation. That is to say, to some, I may seem to get off subject from time to time, but I assure you, if you stick with me, you will see that everything connects perfectly and seamlessly, like a jigsaw puzzle. So before we get into this, I feel it necessary for the ones who don't know or who think we are dealing solely in conspiracy theories, who NASA really is. So let's discuss Operation Paperclip. Between 1945 and 1959, the United States Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency conducted a secret program in which more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians such as Wernher von Braun and his V-2 rocket team were blackmailed and imported to the U.S. for government employment. Most of these men went to two agencies that were also currently in the process of inception: the CIA, founded in 1947, and NASA, founded in 1958. In other words, these agencies were employed in their beginning years mostly by blackmailed Nazis. To express the extent to which the US government went to cover this up, here's Wernher von Braun's declassified CIA file, which shows the process in which he and the rest of the Nazis were brought into the United States. At first, they appear to be brought to the U.S. as illegal aliens and kept at military interrogation camps, where they are Americanized and then given a cover story. They then seem to be sent to Mexico to come back across the border alone. Wernher von Braun was put on a train once he entered the U.S. with the cover story of being a businessman from Geneva, but he accidentally sat next to an actual American businessman from Geneva and almost blew his cover. Once granted citizenship, Wernher von Braun was then granted top-secret clearance by a NASA administrator on June 27, 1960. As director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center during the Apollo program, he would go on to invent the Saturn V rockets, which are claimed to be the rockets used to take men into space and onto the moon. It almost seems as though this entire operation somewhat revolves around von Braun, which I think you will begin to see later in this film. As I previously stated, Operation Paperclip ran until 1958. Is it not suspicious that the very year after the operation ends, the blackmailed Nazis from said operation, who in just one decade would claim to take us into space and to the moon, and who would receive $50 million per day in taxpayer funds, would found NASA? So what is the purpose of the blackmailing? Think about this in simple terms. When a mob boss has dirt on a politician, they blackmail that politician with that dirt in order to get that politician to do things they wouldn't normally do for the benefit of the mob. The mob has no connection to the politicians other than the dirt they blackmail and direct them with, so there is no blowback if the politician is found out. So what was the reason the US government was blackmailing these Nazis? No, it wasn't a space race between Russia and the US and military advantage over the Soviet Union in the Cold War, as the official narrative will tell you. That was just the cover story we were sold. It was in fact a multitude of cover-ups, and the blackmailed Nazis were just the convenient patsies. Operation Paperclip was a failsafe in case the true intentions and future actions of NASA and the CIA were ever exposed. The government could just blame the psychological operations on Nazis who secretly invaded America after World War II. But before we get into those cover-ups, we have to talk about the years and events leading up to NASA and the CIA. Before Operation Paperclip, there was a 33rd degree Master Freemason, explorer, and naval officer named Admiral Richard E. Byrd, who manned the first Antarctic expedition in 1928. This man seemed to become transfixed on Antarctica after his first expedition, later leading 4 more Antarctic expeditions from the years 1934 to 1956. In the expedition of 1933 through 1935, 60 of the 82 members were Freemasons. On February 5th, 1935, they established the first Antarctic Lodge number 777. Just months after World War II ended, the U.S. Navy launched the largest military operation in history called Operation High Jump with 4,700 men, 13 ships, and 33 aircraft. The mission was comprised of 3 task forces set out in different directions and expected to last 6 through 8 months. However, the fleet returned in only 6 weeks. On December 8, 1954, Admiral Byrd was interviewed about his expeditions on Longgain's chronoscope. He would go on to say this.
Byrd, you've been to both the North Pole and the South Pole. Is there any unexplored land left on this Earth that might appeal to adventurous young Americans?
Yes, there is. But strangely enough, there's left in the world today an area as big as the United States that's never been seen by a human being. And that's beyond the pole on the other side of the South Pole from Middle America. And I think it's quite astonishing that there should be an area as big as that unexplored.
This is a tremendous
So
challenge.
there's a lot of adventure left down at the bottom of the world. So I'm willing to say to you that there will be a number of expeditions that will follow, I think, year after year, at the bottom of the world, because the government has really become interested.
When asked why the government has become so interested in this unexplored continent, he said this.
I tell you one reason they're interested. It's by far the most valuable, important place left in the world for science. That's why the scientific groups all over the nation are really interested.
Byrd's final Antarctic expedition was in 1955, called Operation Deep Freeze, and was concluded in 1956 with no military or scientific expeditions following. This is suspicious since Byrd just claimed in 1954 that both the government and military had become interested in Antarctica. Operation Deep Freeze was documented by Disney Studios, who would later work with Werner von Braun to produce a film about manned space travel in 1955. We will talk more about that later. Not long after, Byrd died a suspicious death. Seemingly healthy enough in 1956 to go on another expedition to Antarctica, he would die in his sleep of a heart ailment at the age of 68 on March 11, 1957. So what could have halted these expeditions and interest in this area? If you weren't already aware, there's a treaty titled the Antarctic Treaty that forbids all unapproved travel below the 60th south parallel and subsequently establishes the country as a scientific preserve. It was signed in 1959 and effective in 1961. This is the first major treaty that submits a part of the world to a specific international governance. It was originally signed by 48 of the world's most important and powerful nations and has been held in agreement since first signed by all countries. Another first. The Cold War years date from 1947 through 1991, where it is claimed that there was extreme tension between the US and Soviet Union, yet they still discussed, agreed, and signed on the same treaty in the earliest years of the Cold War. Remember how the cover story for Operation Paperclip is military advantage in the Cold War? Is the cohesive timeline of all this starting to come into perspective now? We can find proof of this treaty being enforced in the case of Jarle Andhoy, skipper of the Berserk, on his expedition to Antarctica, who was reportedly met by armed ships threatening to open fire on them if they did not turn back. Many will claim that you can just take tours to anywhere in Antarctica, but Antarctica has only 3 entry points sanctioned by the Antarctic Treaty through which civilians may tour Antarctica under the supervision of pre-planned tours. Any solo expedition to Antarctica must notify the State Department in advance and attain the proper permits. Once there, any entry into scientifically protected areas results in criminal penalties. Now let's get back to the multitude of cover-ups NASA was created for. What Admiral Byrd found or confirmed in Antarctica is key, because as I've articulated here, it seems to have triggered a chain of events all leading up to the pointless necessity of placing men on the moon 6 times. As I said, Byrd was a master mason, raised in Federal Lodge No. 1 in Washington, D.C. on March 19, 1921, 7 years before his first Antarctic expedition. If you read between his exoteric symbolism when he speaks about Antarctica, he says that there's a vast land beyond Antarctica that is unexplored and rich in resources. Antarctica was fully charted and added to the world map in scale. So how did a chunk of land as big as the United States go undiscovered for so long? So unfortunately, even though I've primed your minds for what I am about to say, this is where I'm going to lose some of you. Admiral Byrd found that the charted maps on a globe are all wrong. He found that the Earth is much, much bigger than what we are told, with unexplored lands rich in resources. In a nutshell, he discovered that the Earth is indeed flat. Far before the existence of NASA, in 1931, one man named Auguste Piccard would take a high-altitude balloon ride all the way up to 51,775 feet. He was the first to ever reach this altitude and the first ever to record what he saw in the stratosphere. He stated in a Popular Science article that when looking at the Earth out of the portholes of the capsule, that it seemed a flat disk with an upturned edge. His findings match what we see when we send up high-altitude balloons to this altitude without fisheye lenses attached to the cameras. On Friday, January 11, 1907, an article would be published in the Hawaiian Gazette featuring a map that was discovered in a Buddhist temple in the mountains of central Japan. The map is speculated to be created by Chinese priests thousands of years ago. On this map, we see the continents projected on a flat plane with the North Pole in the center and no Antarctica, but instead scattered continents beyond the Antarctic Circle. It also has the Tropic of Cancer, the Equator, the Tropic of Capricorn, and the Antarctic Circle properly labeled. This begs the question, how did someone from several thousand years ago accurately chart the continents when it is claimed that this wasn't able to be done until after the end of the 15th century? And how did they know of the extra land, which Byrd would later confirm? The United Nations logo, which is an azimuthal equidistant map projection, and which is the same map projection we see on the ancient map from the article, was created in 1946, the same year as the inception of Operation Paper. That same map projection was used in World War II as a strategic war map, in JFK's War Room, and in JFK's Air Force One. On June 24, 1955, Admiral Byrd discussed his polar expeditions of the Antarctic region on NBC News in front of an azimuthal equidistant map in the studio set's background. Again, just like the map from the article, there is no Antarctica on NBC's map. Before Admiral Byrd ever took those expeditions to Antarctica, naval officer Sir James Clark Ross would discover the Antarctic Shelf, a 150-foot ice wall, in 1841 and would name it the Great Ice Barrier. On the modern azimuthal equidistant maps, Antarctica is shown as a ring of ice surrounding the continents inside of the ring. This ice barrier holds in the waters of our oceans from the lands beyond the ice wall. So what about the North Pole? If the South Pole isn't actually a continent, but rather a giant ice wall, then maybe the North Pole isn't an expanding and shrinking continent of ice like they say either. On Old World maps between the 15th and 17th centuries, we see a North Pole that appears to be 4 separate land masses with a small island in the middle. Many maps by many different map makers drew this exact same North Pole on their maps at the time. However, in the 17th century, the 4 islands at the top of the map ceased and we began to see more or less what we are used to seeing on the maps nowadays. Although these maps were using the current globe Earth theory, the fact that these maps show the same northern hemisphere which would mysteriously disappear from the Earth a century later is significant to our investigation. It becomes even more significant when we read a letter from Gerardus Mercator, who created the Mercator map projection, an innovation that is still employed in nautical charts. In his letter to John Dee, he wrote, "In the midst of the 4 countries is a whirlpool, into which there empty the 4 indrawing seas which divide the north. And the water rushes round and descends into the earth just as if one were pouring it through a filter funnel, except that right under the pole there lies a bare rock in the midst of the sea. Its circumference is about 33 French miles, and it is all of magnetic stone." Many of these maps call the magnetic stone Rupus nigra, or the Black Rock. On an azimuthal equidistant map, the North Pole is at the center of the map. This is why our compasses all point north. When we circumnavigate the Earth, we don't go around it like an ant crawling all over an orange. We go around it like we ride our canoes around a lake, or like how we ride a bike around the block. As this video will illustrate, when we go west or east, the compass head keeps turning, which we course correct for, and eventually brings us back to our original starting point. Going in any straight line for too long eventually becomes south. All the stars in the sky are claimed to be traveling on their own random paths, as we on Earth are also on our own random path, orbiting 66,000 miles per hour around the Sun, as the Sun is shooting through the Milky Way galaxy at 500,000 miles per hour, while the Milky Way galaxy is shooting through the universe at 1.3 million miles per hour. Yet when we trace star trails in time-lapse photography, they all rotate in perfect circles over our heads and around our North Star Polaris. Furthermore, we see the same stars every night. According to what we are told by the scientific community and NASA, what we should see is random zigzagging star trail patterns. Also, at the speed we are claimed to be traveling, these stars should be different every night.